Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thanks for joining us. My name is Lauren Gilbert. I'm the Senior Manager for Public Services at the Center for Jewish History. I hope you've seen the slideshow of some of our upcoming events. You can register for any of those via the calendar on our website, which is cjh.org. During the program, you can ask questions for Jayne in the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window. Not the chat, which I think I disabled so that we'll see all the questions in one place, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Let's get right into it. I'll introduce Jayne. Jayne Cohen writes and lectures extensively in the US and England about Jewish cuisine and culture, and created and moderated an annual program for 7 years on Jewish cuisine around the world at New York's Museum of Jewish Heritage. Her most recent book, Jewish Holiday Cooking, A Food Lover's Treasury of Classics and Improvisations, was named a James Beard Award finalist in international cooking. She has appeared on numerous radio and TV shows and has written for print and web publications, including the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Boston Globe, Gourmet, and Bon Appetit, as well as Epicurious.com, among others. She is currently working on a book about food stories from around the world. Thank you for joining us, Jayne. I will turn on your camera and turn off mine, and I will put up your slides.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Lauren, for inviting me here today. And thank you to all of our listeners for sharing in our journey today. First off, we want to avoid any mid-afternoon slump. So I'd like to welcome you all with some mouth-watering snacks. Unfortunately, they'll all have to be virtual ones. How about some matzoh balls that are spiked with cilantro and jalapeno, or empanadas that are chock full of pastrami asado? Matzoh with a smear of cream cheese and guava jam? Maybe sufganiyot, you know, the Hanukkah jelly donuts, but filled with Colombian dulce de leche. These sound like the inventions of a creative chef on the Lower East Side, or maybe a mashup from a trendy LA food truck, right? Well, you might find them there, but these dishes originated and are still being eaten in Latin America's Jewish kitchens today. Just when did the Jews arrive in Latin America? Most histories begin with the Spanish and Portuguese conquest of the New World. And it is true that Jews began arriving right after the Edict of Expulsion with Columbus in 1492 seeking refuge. So they were known as conversos, or new Christians, Jews who had converted to Catholicism because it was illegal to practice Judaism in any Spanish and later any Portuguese territories. But many of these conversos were crypto or hidden Jews, Jews who had either never stopped practicing Judaism or returned to their Jewish faith thinking they'd be safe when they came to the New World. Because unfortunately, they were not. The Inquisition is not some relic of the 16th century. It actually wasn't abolished until the 19th century. And its long arm stretched even as far as the American Southwest, which was then under Spanish rule. But there still was a continuous emigration of conversos from the Iberian Peninsula and via the Amsterdam route. And some of these Jews were quite successful in the New World, establishing trade routes to Colombia, sugar plantations in Brazil, and so on. But eventually, all of this early Jewish life was snuffed out. In time, these Jews were rooted out by the Inquisition and forced to stop practicing Judaism and assimilate. Or they were burnt at the stake, expelled, or they simply vanished to other colonies like Dutch Amsterdam or Curacao. Disappeared, but not without a trace. Because today there are still areas, indigenous communities in the Amazon, Colombia, and in Mexico, as well as in more urban places throughout Latin America, where descendants of these conversos although they're practicing Catholics, have been maintaining Jewish traditions, certain ones, for centuries. Rituals like lighting candles on Friday nights or abstaining from pork. In northern Mexico and parts of Texas today, around the Passover Lent season, some Christians with converso roots eat pan de semita, that is, bread of the Semites, which is a wheat bread made with oil and never lard. These were the same ingredients that were used by the secret Jews of New Spain. Some of these Christians also toss the first piece of dough into the fire before baking when making tortillas or bread, which is a traditional Jewish bread ritual. And some of them actually, on discovering their roots, have converted back to Judaism. So now what about a food trace? Well, these conversos didn't leave cookbooks, but we do have a record of what they ate from a rather ironic source, Inquisition records. Actual testimonies about the so-called Jewish foods the conversos ate, which the inquisitors claimed were proof positive that they remained Jews in their heart. For example, there was a Mexican Sabbath stew that was made with salt cod, fresh fish, chickpeas, and hard-boiled eggs. And in Brazil, one Jewish family removed the sciatic nerve, not to kosherize the meats, mind you, but because they thought it would make the meats taste better. So they even removed the sciatic nerve from the legs of pigs. And in 1589, Luis de Carvajal confessed to the inquisitors that on Passover, because he had no matzahs, he decided to eat corn tortillas because they were unleavened and also they were made without yeast. Even today, many Mexican Sephardim still enjoy their kosher for Passover tortillas instead of matzahs. Now, with the colonists' independence from Spain and Portugal beginning in the 19th century, our food story picks up again as new Jewish immigrants began arriving. First, Sephardic Jews by way of the Ottoman Empire in North Africa, followed by Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe, who later joined them in greater numbers. And the largest waves of both Sephardi and Ashkenazi Jews arrived in the 20th century, especially after immigration to the US was severely restricted. These Jews became peddlers in the cities and in the Amazon basin, ranchers in Argentina and Brazil, professionals, industrialists, writers, in short, members of the very diverse Jewish communities in the many countries that make up this area. Today, the total Jewish population is somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000. Now, there is no unified Latin American Jewish cuisine narrative. Many communities have quite different food stories to tell, but there are some themes and patterns that are common to all of them. So let's explore those first. And then we'll look more closely at the countries with the largest Jewish populations. These are Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico. We'll also take a look at Cuba because its story is such an interesting one, as well as the food of US Jews with Latin American roots. Like all diasporic people, Jews have always adopted and adapted from the cuisines of their new homelands. But just how much to adopt and adapt, how much to integrate as a people and still maintain their Jewishness has always been a dilemma. For some very traditional Jews, this may mean moving to a new country, but not really being there, more passing through than making a new life in a new homeland. These are the communities least likely to change their recipes and food traditions. And we can see this most clearly in the more religious, older Ashkenazi Jews in, for example, some communities in Argentina who try their best to make the same gefilte fish and potato latkes and so on that their grandparents did. And then there are those who may or may not strictly observe the kosher laws, but who do observe some or even all of the holidays. In their food choices, they may inhabit a place that balances tradition with a desire for more modernity. And as they become familiar with the foods of their new homelands, they may try to kosherize some of the mainstream recipes. For example, Ruth Behar, who is an author and a cultural anthropologist, a professor at University of Michigan, describes how her mother cooked from the Cuban Cocina Criolla cookbook, kosherizing recipes like caldo gallego, which is a white bean soup. Now, Ruth's mother substituted kosher beef fry and chicken to replace the pork. Other Jews may substitute new local ingredients, for example, tropical fruits, to replace the apples in their traditional recipes. And then there is a more recent phenomenon where Jewish food is celebrated as a cuisine, celebrated for its gastronomy without its religious aspects, and often not even kosher. It's something you may have seen not just in trendy restaurants in Israel and here in the US, but also in Canada, in England, France, and Germany, and now in Latin America. When I first began writing about Latin American Jewish food over 10 years ago, I was surprised that there wasn't more creative Jewish cookery going on in Argentina, which is the Latin American country with the largest Jewish population, now about 170,000, which is down from a much higher number decades ago. Most of the food then, about 10 years ago, was quite traditional Ashkenazi, and to a lesser extent, Sephardi and Middle Eastern cooking. This slide shows the superbly juicy, well-marbled and grass-fed Argentine beef that's grilled over an open fire in a way that imparts a deep, smoky flavor throughout the meat. And this is from a kosher Argentine restaurant in Buenos Aires, Al Galope. Actually, one of the most talked about Jewish food stories in Buenos Aires at the time was the kosher McDonald's, the only one outside of Israel. All that has changed, however, with the new inventive hot restaurants like Tomas Kalika's Meshuggeneh and others in Buenos Aires that attract both non-Jews and Jews alike. So we'll talk more about the restaurant scene in Buenos Aires later. Let's turn now to the issue of ingredients, starting with the big P, the pig, so ubiquitous in mainstream Latin American cuisine, with the exception, of course, of Argentina, where cow is king. So, yes, lechon, carnitas, chicharrones, jamon, lard. How do you get around that iconic unkosher animal? Do you ignore it? Do you find kosher substitutes for it? Or do you eat it? Similarly with shellfish, many of these countries have vast coastlines and shellfish figures heavily in their cooking. There are many different ways, often surprisingly creative, that Jews have dealt with the question of kosher, as we'll see throughout this discussion. On the other hand, many Sephardi and Latin American dishes do share a common ancestor, the Iberian Peninsula, because remember that Jews who came from Ottoman lands and also from some of the lands in North Africa have their roots in Spain and Portugal as well. And by the way, For Sephardim who came to Latin America speaking Judeo-Spanish languages like Ladino and Xacatia, the Spanish Jewish language of northern Morocco, as well as those who came from Tangier and other parts of modern Spanish-speaking Morocco, the transition to Latin America in terms of language was easier than it was for European Ashkenazi Jews. And by the same token, I think in many ways, the transition was also easier culinarily speaking. These Sephardi Jews had also grown up eating savory pastries like pasteles and empanadas and borrecas, enjoying fried buñuelas, which are Sephardi pancakes, and flan, custard. Used to Aleppo and Urfa and marash peppers, chipotles and other chiles were not so different. The Sephardis also had a taste for rice and for flavorings like orange juice, cumin, pomegranates, and tamarind. And for the alfajores, the cookie with a filling of dulce de leche that is enormously popular in both cuisines. And because the Jewish population in these countries is usually small, there's often intermarriage between the Sephardi and Ashkenazi Jews, with a consequent blending of food traditions. Then, since fresh vegetables and fruits, including many new subtropical ones, are quintessential to Sephardi and mainstream Latin cuisines, since these fresh local vegetables and fruits are so easily available and abundant, there was often a greening of what had been very brown Ashkenazi tables of long cooked meats and typically wintry root vegetables, with new salads and new vegetables. Passion fruit is one of the examples of the new subtropical fruits. It may seem like a long way from gefilte fish to guacamole or chipotle to chulent, but actually, putting aside the pork and shellfish question, I think there are real affinities even between Latin American and Ashkenazi Jewish cuisines. Affinities that actually make for great crossover opportunities, starting with the cuts of beef that both enjoy and that take so easily to Latin American sauces and spices. Think of ropa vieja, the shredded beef stew, which is terrific made with brisket, or skirt steak, a kosher cut and a favorite in Argentina, where it is served with chimichurri, a green herb sauce. And classic Sabbath roast chicken, but now served with a mojo sauce of bitter orange, garlic, and oregano. And then there are all those starchy foods like kugels and latkes, or chulent, the long-cooked Sabbath stew, that are just waiting for a mole or a chile to wake up the flavors. Many tropical foods seem ready-made for Jewish desserts, like the passion fruit you just saw, ready to top a Shavuot cheesecake, or guava to fill rugelach, fluden, and even hamantaschen. And Latino fried foods like tostones and churros. Tostones, by the way, they're plantains, and churros, which are these fried fritters and are served dusted with sugar, are actually perfect for Hanukkah. Which brings us to the Jewish holidays. It's both very Latin and very Jewish to celebrate holidays and life cycle events with food. So the Jewish holidays, the whole cycle is rooted in the seasons. So many holiday foods are traditionally seasonal ones. For Rosh Hashanah, for example, pomegranates, early spring vegetables for Passover. But roughly half of Latin Americans Jews live in the Southern Hemisphere. So their seasonal cycle is reversed. making Passover a holiday with early fall foods and Sukkot a feast of late spring dishes instead of the autumn harvest. Marjorie Agosin, who is a professor of Spanish at Wellesley, she's also a poet, an author, and a human rights activist. Marjorie described it to me this way. Passover comes to Santiago, Chile in autumn at the beginning of the school year. It's a lot like Rosh Hashanah then. Marjorie went on to describe the pomegranates and purple-green figs that filled the silver dishes on her grandparents' snow-white tables that were set up outdoors for the holidays. Of course, the difference in seasons is not the only reason that holiday foods may differ. Well, as I mentioned, Jews in some Latin American countries have clung to the familiar ingredients that families have always used for their traditional recipes, especially for holiday foods. Others have experimented with new ones, sometimes by necessity, but often embracing the new by choice. For example, in Brazil, which has about 93,000 Jews, many Jews would eat mostly local foods for every day, with the more traditional Jewish ones for holidays. And they might also adopt different Brazilian dishes that spoke to their Jewish holiday needs. Creme caramel is a Brazilian favorite, and many Jews serve it on holidays. Quindim, which is a coconut custard from Bahia, can be made dairy-free and served at meat meals. Some included mango in their Passover fruit and nut paste, charoset, and some put guava in their desserts. But in the past 25 to 35 years, there's been an unusual integration of local, especially Afro-Brazilian cooking traditions with Jewish dishes. This is the influence of the domestic help, who are generically referred to as the Marias. In fact, there was even a book published about this phenomenon. You see, in many middle-class Brazilian families, cooking was always the domain of the domestic help only. But as the culture around cuisine began to change in Latin America, and there was a great interest in cooking, many Brazilians went into the kitchens and cooked with their Marias. The Marias introduced new ingredients like flour from yucca, which is also known as manioc, and cassava. And here's a photo of the manioc. They would put the yucca, flour made from the yucca, in challah, for example. They added buttery Brazil nuts to a Rosh Hashanah honey cake. Shavuot foods like blintzes and varenikis might be filled with Nina cheese, the local substitute for European white cheeses. And when it came to Passover, they made use of grain-free flours from tubas like yucca, as well as tapioca, which is derived from the yucca roots. And whether you call it manioc, cassava, yucca, or tapioca, as it goes by various names depending on what country you come from, this flour comes from a tuber. So it can replace wheat flour that's forbidden on Passover. And by the way, of course, it's also gluten-free. So also on Passover, Brazilian Jews might serve pão de queijo. These are these delicious fluffy rolls that are made with grated white cheese and tapioca flour. And gefilte fish could be made with Amazon fish because, yes, Lauren, piranhas are kosher. So how do you make what is often a quite bland gefilte fish appealing to the Latin American Jews who are now used to far zestier Latin American flavors? Well, in Mexico, cooks might add chipotles to the poached fish balls, or they may prepare Veracruzana style, the way red snapper is often served there. And as you can see, it's served warm in a heady sauce of tomatoes, olives, garlic, oregano, capers, and as you can see, little bits of it, jalapeno. So now is a good time to zero in on Mexico, which has a thriving community of somewhere between 40 to 60,000 Jews, a community that is expected to grow and where there is little anti-Semitism. At synagogues in Mexico City, tequila may be served for Saturday morning kiddush, along with guacamole for bagels and challah. And you can buy kosher prepared street foods like flautas and nopales. Mexico is such a food-centric city, from the street vendors selling mouth-watering tacos and elote, which is corn on the cob that's smothered with crema, cheese, and chiles. From those kind of street foods to the rarefied haute cuisine restaurants of Mexico City. And the Mexican Jews that I have interviewed said that even if they wanted to avoid the siren song of the delicious dishes of mainstream cuisine there, it would be impossible. And besides, who would want to? So Mexican Jewish cooks have devised some truly inspired hybrids of the two cuisines. And the result may very well be that Mexican Jewish cookery is the pinnacle of Latin American Jewish cuisine. A case in point, Mexican Jewish food writer Susan Schmidt, who named her kosher food blog Jalapeno after her signature challah, which is filled with jalapeno peppers. Susan tells the story of her Hungarian grandmother who hated Mexican food when she arrived from Budapest. The spices, the tortillas. But eventually, at the big Sunday family dinners she hosted, she would serve her goulash and her chicken paprikash with sides of hot tortillas, guacamole, serrano peppers, and a bowl of cilantro leaves. And she put chipotles in her goulash. What a perfect example of food telling a history of migrations. Susan's own Mexican flavors are not just accompaniments. They're fully integrated into her Jewish recipes. Often they come about from her experiments trying to kosherize Mexican dishes. For example, to make smooth, creamy dough for tamales, she needs schmaltz, chicken fat, instead of lard, into the dough, masa, which is made from cornmeal. And she does some pretty weird things with gribanas, you know, those crispy cracklings that are made from schmaltz, poultry skin, and onions. Gribanas, of course, are the Jewish counterpart to chicharrones, the pork version. Well, Susan stirs gribanas into refritos. And by the way, refritos does not mean refried beans. Refritos means well-fried beans. So Susan stirs the gribanas into those beans. Her mother stirs tortilla chips with guacamole and gribanas to replace the chicharrones. Sounds pretty delicious, right? And instead of using dairy cream in recipes, which could contravene the laws against mixing meat and milk, she often substitutes the Mexican flavor of avocado puree. Her brisket and her flanken Jewish short ribs, are flavored with chile de árbol. And when she makes desserts, Susan sprinkles them with lime and with piloncillo, which is a Mexican type of brown sugar. Latkes, both potato pancakes and other kinds made from different tubers, might offer a blank canvas to a Mexican cook. Susan serves hers. She puts refritos on hers, or guava jelly. It's Ilan Stavins, a Mexican Jewish writer, who puts mole on his latkes. But for Passover, there's nothing like a brisket taco with salsa verde, says Sandra Siklak, a Mexico City-born Jewish chef who now makes her home in the U.S. Besides the rabbinically certified kosher for Passover tortillas for those who eat corn on the holiday, there are also wheat-based tortillas that are made from matzoh meal dough. So we've already looked at some of the ways that Brazilian and Jewish cuisines have come together. But for years, feijoada, Brazil's national dish, was out of reach for all of the country's religious Jews. This is a traditional feijoada. Now, feijoada would make an excellent substitute for the long simmering Sabbath stews like cholent or the Sephardi version, chamin. Except, of course, and if you look closely, you can see some of these, it's made with every part of the pig: ears, tails, ribs, bacon, sausages, as well as beef and black beans, kale, and oranges. Now, it happens that the most famous feijoada restaurant in Sao Paulo, Bolinha, is located right next to a Chabad house. Chabad is, of course, the traditional Orthodox Jewish outreach organization that stretches around the world. Well, the smells from the restaurant Bolinha were tantalizing the congregation, many of whom were Baal Tshuva, that is, formerly secular Jews who had become religious but may have eaten Bolinha's feijoada in a former life. So the Chabad rabbi threw down the gauntlet to Bolinha. Come up with a glatt kosher version for my congregation. Well, it took 8 months of experimenting using different cuts of beef and various seasoning. But in the end, the kosher version turned out so well that it is now made in a special kosherized part of the restaurant kitchen, frozen and served retail. But perhaps it's fitting that the most dynamic Jewish restaurants are now in Buenos Aires, home to the largest Jewish community in Latin America, where the rich blend of both Ashkenazi and Sephardi traditions produces a thriving food and culture scene there. Many of the restaurants in the Jewish community are kosher, including, as mentioned, the parrillas, the steakhouses, which feature smoky grilled meats, and Argentine dishes like sliders on grilled arepas. Arepas are those little corn cakes, as well as milanesas, which are chicken schnitzels, but breaded with matzoh meal. But for the past 6 years, trendy new unkosher restaurants have joined them. Cocina Judía, which translates as Jewish cooking, a celebration of Jewish cuisine as gastronomy without the religious aspects, is having quite a moment now. Ola Jacoba was the first restaurant to identify its menu as Cocina Judía for an open community. That is, a cuisine with crossover appeal to both Jews and non-Jews. At first, the owners worried that Jewish and Jewish food were taboo because, as many of you know, Argentina has quite a history of anti-Semitism. But then they figured, we wondered why Jewish food couldn't be like Japanese or Mexican, something for anyone who wants to try something different. Their well-made dishes like pastrami empanadas and dulce de leche blintzes found an audience with both Jews and non-Jews. And now the audience for Ola Jacoba's food is about 50-50, half Jews and half non-Jews. But the biggest smash hit has been Tomas Kalika's restaurant's meshuggeneh. Meshuggeneh, of course, meaning crazy in Yiddish, and fayer, flame roasted. Mishiguene opened in 2014, and it was voted one of Latin America's 50 best restaurants. Think of that, a Jewish restaurant in Argentina being voted one of the 50 best restaurants in Argentina. In fact, Mishiguene even had a run here this fall as a pop-up restaurant in Manhattan's meat market. I ate there twice, and it was really wonderful cuisine and just so much fun. Kalika totally reinvents the way that Argentina does Jewish comfort food. His menu is a mix of Ashkenazi, Sephardi, and current diaspora foods, but seen through his unique Argentine lens. Now here we have the pastrami asado. Now to make this pastrami asado, Kalika takes a caveman-sized beef rib with the bone in. He seasons it and cures it pastrami style, and then he grills it in the Argentine way. The whole process takes a total of 13 days. He even serves a pastrami ice cream. For gefilte fish, he compresses the ground fish into elegant little discs and cooks them sous vide. Hugely popular with non-Jews, the restaurant offers a window into Jewish life as well, and not just with food. Because every Friday night at Meshuggeneh, and as he did at his restaurant in the pop-up in the meat market, a klezmer band would play traditional Jewish music, and the whole staff would dance around all of the tables in a conga line. For all of the patrons, it was really like being at a bar mitzvah, and just a tremendously joyous event. Now, unlike the Argentinian one, the Cuban Jewish community is small. But the Cuban Jewish community is a remarkable one. It's actually a totally reinvented one. The first real Jewish community started there by American Jews after the Spanish-American War in 1898, when Spain ceded Cuba to the US. Then Sephardim from Turkey and other Ottoman lands arrived, and they were eventually joined by Eastern European Jews. In fact, Polaco, Spanish for Polish, is still the term that Cubans use for Jews, even if the person has Syrian roots and no relation to Ashkenazi or Poland at all. But that's actually not a slur, because there is very little anti-Semitism in Cuba. After Castro came to power, at least 90% of the 15,000 to 16,000 Jews left Cuba for the United States and other countries. Under the Castro regime, religion was outlawed. Matzoh and other Jewish foods that came from Canada were, to a large extent, the Cubans' only Jewish link to their culture and their heritage. But after the breakup of the former Soviet Union, Cuba, which had depended heavily on the Soviets for financial support, suffered a tremendous financial blow. And as a result, Castro revised the Constitution. And beginning in 1992, Cubans were no longer forbidden to practice religion. Through the help of Jewish international organizations like the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee and a Havana Jewish dentist, a renaissance of Cuban Jewish life followed. Today, there are about 1,500 Jews there, though many may not be considered traditional or halakhic Jews. The community is as multicultural and multiracial as Cuba itself. People with Jewish ancestors and Jewish spouses who have joined the very vibrant Jewish community, as well as many converts. When it comes to food, there are definite advantages, culinarily speaking, to being Jewish in Cuba. It's not just the Shabbat chicken, which is served on Friday nights at some of the synagogues, or the packages of matzoh, canned tuna, oil, and other kosher goods that are sent by Jewish organizations for Passover that relieve some of the monotony of the mostly rice and beans Cuban diet. You see, for Jews, there's even an occasional steak and onions. It's why non-Jews come to the kosher butcher and say, what do I have to do to become Jewish? Find me a polaco to marry so I can eat beef for the rest of my life. I'll explain. The only beef available in all of Cuba is from the single as in, yes, only one kosher butcher in the country. And it's only for Jews. Why? Well, the Cuban government allows for a set amount of pork per person. But since the early days of Castro's revolution, the government, recognizing that Jews don't eat pork, had permitted the butcher to distribute only three quarters of a pound of beef, kosher beef, per person per week. So how do they prepare it? Well, they might make a palomillo steak, pounded very thin, marinated with lots of garlic, lime juice, and fried up with onions. Or if it's a cut like brisket, ropa vieja translates as old clothes or schmaltz, which is started with a sofrito of garlic, onions, peppers, tomatoes, and then slow cooked with cumin, olives, capers, and finally shredded. And in an attempt to attract Jewish tourists to Cuba, though I'm not sure how many American Jews are allowed to go now because Trump has reinstated travel restrictions all over again. But the Cuban government had established a purpose-built Hotel Raquel for Jewish tourists so that they would feel at home in an old Jewish neighborhood of Old Havana where peddlers used to go to pick up old goods from boats. The hotel restaurant now features Jewish dishes, which are recipes that were culled from the internet. And it was, in fact, on a return trip to Cuba that Ruth Behar, a Juban, whose family we met before, as Juban is the way some Jewish American of Cuban descent refer to themselves. It was in Cuba on a recent trip, on a past trip, that Ruth first discovered Passover timba. Now, since she was a little girl, Ruth had been used to eating timba. Timba is a combination of guava and a creamy white cheese. But on this research trip, she learned from the Jewish community in Camagüey how good timba actually is on matzoh, especially when it's made with the local cow's cheese and with fresh guava. So what about these Jubans? For there has always been a third diaspora, a large emigration of Latin American Jews to the US, especially during times of political strife, violence, and economic upheavals. So over the past several decades, many Jews have arrived, not only from Cuba, but from Colombia, Chile, Venezuela, Peru, Brazil, and Argentina. Today in the US, Jews of Latin American descent number anywhere from 60 to upwards of 150,000. Historically, the Latin Jewish population of Miami has largely been Cuban, some 15,000 Cuban Jews in Miami alone. But that has been changing with the huge influx of South Americans to South Florida. The Colombian Jewish chef, Sam Gorenstein. Sam is the chef and co-owner of the mini ceviche empire, My Ceviche. He sees the influence of South American Jews at Jewish life cycle events, where ceviche is now replacing sushi as an upscale offering. These are Sam's guava-filled sufganiyot that he makes for Hanukkah, and a recipe of his mom's. Another Miami-based chef, James Beard Award winner Michelle Bernstein. Michelle celebrates her Latin roots with a soup that she calls the history of my palate in a bowl. That soup is a reworking of her mother's Jewish chicken soup with malanga, culantro, cilantro, lime, chayote, achiote, all Latin American products, and loads of fresh dill and the airiest mini matzo balls. Mexico City-born chef Fanny Gerson grew up eating dishes like challah, laced with Mexican cinnamon and with apples, and gefilte fish that is spiced with both guajillo and chipotle peppers and then pan-fried and served warm. I think you can see her making a challah right there. Fanny first began cooking Mexican Jewish food in New York at the seders that the restaurant chain Rosa Mexicano has offered to their Jewish patrons for the past 15 years. You can see two different menus. On the left is one of their menus from past years, and on the right is a menu from, I think it's from this year's Seder, which they did offer during the pandemic, though only by delivery. So what kind of dishes did they have at Rosa Mexicano? Well, things like chipotle beef marrow matzo balls, that familiar gefilte fish veracruzana, and barbecued beef brisket that was wrapped in a banana leaf and included dried fruit simas and baby carrots. So now at La New Yorkina, which is Fanny's Mexican sweet shop, she creates special holiday menus of Mexican-inflected Jewish desserts, like rugula that are filled with cherries, along with jalapeno peppers for smokiness and a rustic touch. And those are some of the things that she has for the Jewish fall holidays. So when it comes to Hanukkah, she has sufganiyot, but she fills her jelly donuts with passion fruit, actually passion fruit made into a curd, and quince jam and cinnamon, or with cajeta, which is the Mexican version of dulce de leche. During Passover, she has Mexican chocolate caramel matzah. Now, Gerson also often cooks at charity events to raise funds for different causes, and many times for these events, she cooks her Mexican Jewish feasts, as she has done during the pandemic here in New York. At Toloache and his other Mexican restaurants, Chef Julian Medina began creating Mexican flavored dishes for Jewish holidays after he converted to Judaism. He came up with dishes like potato jalapeno latkes with horseradish crema, and guacamole con pescado ahumado, which is guacamole with smoked fish, and that's a wonderful combination. You can even find Latin American Jewish cooking on mainstream TV, where Patty Chinich celebrates her Mexican Jewish roots on the award-winning PBS show Patty Chinich. At her Mexican show My Mexican Table, and in her cookbooks, displays many of her Mexican Jewish recipes and her roots. Patty, whose family is Ashkenazi, writes about Flora Cohen, a Mexican cooking teacher originally from Syria, who gave Chinich cooking lessons when Chinich was a young bride. Patty took Flora's Mexican Jewish chicken with apricots and tamarind, and she swapped out the Syrian tamarind paste for the sweeter Mexican tamarind syrup, and then she added smoky chipotle peppers to balance out the flavors. That's a recipe that takes a diaspora story and tells of many different threads. So this has been an exploration that brings up a lot of food for thought, if you'll pardon the pun. I'll leave you with some questions to chew on. For example, what might the food choices of Latin American Jews say about their identity as both Latin Americans and as Jews? Does the decision to adopt ingredients and recipes from a new homeland reflect how safe and comfortable people feel there, or how long they intend to stay? Or is it a matter of how distinctive and overwhelming the indigenous food culture is? In some countries, do the food choices reflect generational changes, with more fusion cuisines developing in second and third generations? How many generations do you have to live in a new place before you feel free enough to improvise your most traditional and iconic recipes? And lastly, Jewish cuisine has often been considered a marginalized ethnic cuisine. Foods that, with few exceptions, would only appeal mostly to Jews. Why might this be changing now, even in such traditional countries and communities as Buenos Aires? Well, thank you again for being here and for being such an attentive audience. Hi, Moria.
Thank you so much for this program. I'll just ask you a couple of questions that have come in recently. What could you tell us about Sephardic food?
In general, such a broad question.
Question.
Yeah.
I guess I would say, is that something that's still thriving in Latin American countries today?
Yeah, I mean, I think people traditionally are cooking many of their holiday recipes based on the foods that they ate in their families' kitchens. And there's a significant number of Sephardim in Latin America. So in terms of, to give a broad example, for example, on Passover, Sephardim eat rice, they eat corn, and they eat legumes. Sephardi cuisine includes many filled pastry type foods like pasteles, little hand pies, borecas. They tend to have foods that include a lot of vegetables. It's a much sunnier kind of cuisine. A lot of vegetables, more enthusiastic spicing. And one thing to realize is that Sephardic cooking embraces many different communities. It's not one big monolithic kind of cuisine. The food of Jews who came from Spain originally and settled in Morocco, for example, is quite different from the food of Jews who settled in Turkey. And that's quite different from Jews who settled in Iran. Jews who settled in Iran from Spain and Portugal, they have a cuisine that often has a lot of meat and fruit dishes and a sweet and tangy kind of component. So, and the food of Jews from the Balkan area is again different from some of these other countries as well.
Thank you for unpacking all of that. It's a very complicated mishmash.
Yes. But it is very vegetable heavy. And some things that I think you see, you know, in most of the communities is, for example, stuffed vegetables, things like that.
Somebody else wrote in about the restaurant Mishiguene, and he says that they also serve things like bagels and lox as well as corned beef sandwiches. So it seems like they've taken influences from both the Middle East and North African cuisines as well as some Ashkenazi.
Oh, definitely. I mean, at the pop-up restaurant, they not only had that the gefilte fish sous vide served with these incredibly wonderful crackers, but they start you off with challah and the most delicious bowl of schmaltz that was so richly flavored. So yes, there's a lot of Ashkenazi cuisine there, and you know, pastrami. That pastrami asado is basically, well, Romanian, yeah, Ashkenazi.
And is that pop-up restaurant still open? Do you know?
No. It was in a space that's owned by Lexus place, and they have various pop-up restaurants. Each one has a certain set amount of time. Of course, all the restaurants are closed now, but they were scheduled to open an Indian one after that.
Okay. Let's see. And somebody else asked for clarification about the restaurant Rosa Mexicano. Did they only serve Jewish-influenced meals on the holidays?
Oh, no, you can get the regular menu as well.
But do they have Jewish-influenced food during holiday times?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. I'll ask you one more question. Okay. So, what is your favorite Latin American dish?
Well, I am a very big matzo ball lover, so I'd have to say any of the various matzo ball recipes that I've gotten from Latin American Jews.
Including the jalapeno?
Including the jalapeno, but also in a soup with epazote, a particular Mexican spice, and cilantro. But that, I have to say that gefilte fish, veracruzana, is really pretty delicious. And the idea of taking the fish patties and pan frying them is really a good idea.
Yeah. Definitely some mouth-watering inspirations there. So with that, I think we'll conclude today's program. So thank you all for attending today. And thank you so much, Jayne, for your wonderfully informative as well as visually stimulating presentation. Hope you are not super hungry right now. I hope you all enjoyed it today and will do your own part to explore Latin American Jewish food, as it seems like a sort of underutilized resource.
Thank you so much.